not skirt over. We're not going to deal with issues in masses of detail because it is just too big a topic. So we'll hopefully get an overview. So the issues that we're going to cover today, what costs can be claimed, what do they cover, what is covered in the fee percentage, which of course is a separate item to the schedule of cost components, and the two different types of cost components that we've got, the schedule of cost components and then the shorter schedule, which, as it says, is shorter than the ordinary schedule. So let's get going. Okay, so first of all, when would you use the schedule of cost components as opposed to the shorter schedule? Now, this is all based on NEC 3. It works also for NEC 2 if you're still using that, doubtful. I'm going to touch on at the end how all of this has changed in NEC 4, which I would expect you might be starting to use, or I think you probably will, certainly in the next 12 months or so. So when do you use the schedule of cost components? Well, when you are working under options C, D and E, so they are C and D are the pay and gain contracts, the risk sharing. Option E is the reimbursable. So basically, as you go along with all of those contracts, you are claiming on your interim basis, so typically monthly, your actual costs. And that's what the schedule of cost components does. It sets out, it pretty much lists the categories of people, machinery, plant, etc., that you can claim for as you go along. Now, obviously, with options C and D, there's then the day of reckoning at the end of the project as to whether you've come in under target based on the applications based on the schedule of cost components, or over target, and whether there's going to be any bonus paid, or alternatively money being paid back. So the schedule of cost components is part of the defined cost. So basically how I tend to look at this is it's your actual cost, the actual cost of your work, but always subject to the schedule of cost components. The contractor in the schedule of cost components doesn't include the subcontractor works. Subcontracted works are specifically covered in defined cost, so you need to bear that in mind. Disallowed costs are deducted from any defined costs. So the defined costs include your costs, contractor's costs under the schedule of cost components. It includes subcontracted costs in addition. But from this, defined costs, disallowed costs are deducted. So what are disallowed costs? Well, they're things, as you would imagine, they're disallowed from, so that they're costs that the contractor isn't entitled to. So one example is any costs in respect of defective work if it hasn't been remedied at that stage. And then, as I've already mentioned, the employer pays the contractor's fee and a subcontractor's fee element in addition to that defined cost. So when to use the shorter schedule of cost components? We use this for options A and B, contract options A and B, which sort of makes sense if you use the other one for C, D and D. So what's A and B? Well, they're effectively the fixed price contracts. So as in contrast to C, D and E, where you use the schedule of cost components to price your works as you go along, for A and B, the shorter schedule is only used for compensation events. So why is that? Well, obviously you're on a fixed price contract, so you get paid for the work that you do as you go along based on that fixed price. If there are any extras, changes to the work, extra time, any extra money, that's when you need to turn to the shorter schedule of cost components. Another instance when you can use the shorter schedule is if the project manager and the contractor both agree to use it for options C to E. And also if the project manager makes an assessment of a compensation event, then the project manager is entitled to use the shorter schedule of cost components. Which I must say I always think is a little bit unfair because it is a bit arbitrary, but that's what the contract says. Okay, so looking at contract data as well. So the contract data is the part of the contract that you fill in. Typically, we have these in construction. So with JCT, it's the contract particulars. So it is very much the project specific information. So we have contract data parts 1 completed by the client, the employer, part 2 completed by the contractor, or in a subcontract, the subcontractor completes part 2. Now, I always say this when I do these seminars, please do fill them in, because it's basically, as I've said, it's the project specific information. So it is basically about, you know, what money you will be paid. I don't think any of you guys would not fill it in, but I have had instances of disputes where clients have come to me and they haven't filled in their contract data part 2. So that's not a good start. So you typically will have to fill in the sections that are relevant to your contracts. If you're on A and B, we've seen that it's the schedule, the shorter schedule that applies. So you fill in the data that is relevant to that. If you're on C to E contracts, you fill in the schedule of cost components information. For the design data, you fill in both. And for data for C, D and E, you would also fill in the shorter schedule of cost components. Now, it's a bit tedious, but if you're not familiar with contract data part 2, if you go through it logically, just follow it through and just bear in mind which contract you are under, A, B or C, D and E, and it's pretty clear which parts you need to complete. There are lots of figures there, as in money figures and percentages. Don't miss any out, because remember that all of this is about what money you will be paid in the relevant circumstances. So obviously, you know, as that bottom bullet point says, if there's a blank, then, you know, query, do we assume that means 0? Possibly. I think you would struggle if there are blanks, and you do need to make claims under those items. Okay, so schedule of cost components and the shorter schedule. So key features, this is the kind of very, very high level, what do they consist of? Because, I mean, they're both reasonably long documents. One's about 7-8 pages, probably the shorter schedules, maybe about 5 pages. So they're separated into 7 different sections. It is completely logical, the sections, when you think about it. So the first one, the key one, is the people. So that's the cost of personnel, people. The second one, equipment. So that's the equipment required to build. Next one, plant and materials, as the note says, that's the bricks and mortar. The next one, so number 4 is charges, not quite so obvious. I'll come back to that one. Next one is any manufacture and fabrication. So that's off-site manufacture and fabrication. Probably unlikely that you guys are going to be involved in that unless you are you know, involved in some manufacturing construction work. The next one, so the penultimate one, is design. And this is for off-site designers. Obviously, most designers will work off-site. So that's to cover any extra fees they have, or any fees they have actually in the case of options C, D and E. And finally, insurance. I'm not going to deal with insurance because it's not particularly relevant. It's to do with how money is to be allocated if there is an insurance claim made during the project and the insurers make a payment, so who gets the money, etc. So it's not relevant to this. Please do not think that this entitles you to claim insurance premiums under this section. It doesn't, and I'll come back to that. Insurance premiums are covered within that fee percentage that we looked at earlier. So a couple of points. The people, it says that they're in working areas, so that's as distinct from the site. The site is defined in the contract, and that typically will be, you know, the area where the construction work is being carried out. Working areas typically might be wider, so really it's the areas where the people who are involved in the construction are working. So, for example, you may be, you know, if you're on a greenfield site building, you know, that would be the site, but you may be allowed to use, say, adjacent premises, an adjacent site to put up site cabins, etc. So that would need to be included in your working areas if it wasn't part of your site. The other one is charges, which it's a bit of a funny one. It's basically consumables, so electricity, water, etc. It also includes some small elements of what you would typically categorise as equipment. So it includes a lot of the kit that goes into your site cabins, although your site cabins are actually part of the equipment, and it, as it says there, includes some small tools as well. So that's it high level. So just a few points to note. We've already mentioned this fee percentage. What does the fee percentage cover? Because effectively what you do is you work out your defined cost. So the defined cost for A and B relates to compensation events, extra work. So you look at your shorter schedule of cost components, you cost it in accordance with that, and then you apply the fee percentage to it. With options C, D and E, obviously it's not just for compensation events, it's for the work throughout the project. Again, you use the schedule of cost components this time to calculate what you're entitled to. That's part of your defined cost. The other part is your subcontracted costs, so they're added up, and then the fee percentage gets added to that. So what does your fee percentage cover? The first thing, it covers your overhead and profits. So that is probably the biggest chunk. But note that it does include other items. And this is actually, I mean, it's set out in the guidance notes, some of the items, but here, some of them are here. So insurance, so that goes back to the point that I made before. Your insurance premiums are covered in this fee percentage. Recruitment costs, finance charges, guarantees, bonds, anything like that. So probably that last the second category, they're not huge costs. The key one is going to be overhead and profit, but don't forget about them. That last point, I'm just trying to speed up the slides a bit. Both schedules specifically say that subcontractor has to pass on the benefit of any discounts, etc., up the line. Right, so compensation event, very, very quickly, because hopefully you should all know this. Compensation event, it's the trio of work excellence. So in any see that's all wrapped in one claim. So please don't forget about any of those elements. This next guidance notes, I think, is quite good for contractors. And it's slightly odd wording, but basically what it's the gist of it is contractors not supposed to be worse off financially as a result of a compensation event, which is why have this schedule of cost components, as opposed to the mechanism under JCT, where usually you're looking at contract rates. So, for example, that can not be a great position for a contractor if, for example, the contract rates, if we're looking at contract rates for materials and the cost of materials has gone up, the cost of labour has gone up, something like that, potentially it means the contractor's doing the work but not recovering all the money that it should do. Right, we've already been through this, so these are the 7 headings. A slight spoiler alert with regard to NEC4, we actually have 8 headings in NEC4, and what has been added is subcontractor costs, which I think will make things a lot easier, a lot slicker, and a lot easier for it to understand if you're not familiar with NEC, because as you'll have gathered, the whole thing about disallowed costs and having the subcontractor element of them for C, D and E outside of this schedule of cost components, I think is just a bit confusing, because at the end of the day it's all money, isn't it? So okay, just some comparisons and general points about the schedule and the shorter schedule. They both have the same 7 headings. For both, they specifically say that you can only, unfortunately, you can only include one cost component in one of the headings. So an example of that would be if you were using, say, plant and machinery, so you had a crane, you can claim the cost of the driver, but you can only claim it once. So you can only claim it either under plant and machinery or under people. Did I say it then about the crane driver? Sorry, crane drivers. So, and I mean, it sort of stands to reason, but obviously it's written in there just to be clear. So other than that, there are some differences, and we're going to look at that in a bit more detail. Also, the schedule and the shorter schedule, they're pretty much the same for subcontracts as they are for contracts. So, if you mainly are working under NEC subcontracts, this all counts for you as well. It's all applicable. There's always a delay as these slides move over, and every time I think my computer's going to freeze. Okay, so looking at the people first. So shorter schedule, so remember this is options A and B just for compensation events. So what are you claiming here in terms of people? So this is in regard to extra work as a result of a compensation event. The rest of your work obviously is on your lump sum with options A and B. So what you're claiming is the cost of the people that are paid by the contractor. It includes the subcontractors for options A and B. And as we've seen, they've got to be working in the working areas, or that they usually work in the working areas. In the schedule, as opposed to the shorter schedule, you claim the cost of employees. So that's different to the cost of people. Employees are people employed by you. Now, why is that? Because obviously we've seen that subcontractors are claimed in the disallowed cost outside of the schedule of cost components. Now, there's a whole list here of things that you can claim. So, when we're talking about the cost, you're not just talking about salaries, you're talking about the extra national insurance payable, any health insurance, for example, bonuses. So it is that the genuine cost to a business, to the contractor, of employing a specific individual. We've covered that third point. Yeah, covered all of that. People continued. Yeah, so just remember to make sure everything is included, because there's a default position that if you can't claim a specific cost under the schedule of cost components, then you're deemed to have included it within the fee percentage, which sometimes does cause people problems. Just note, the schedule of cost components at 12C, one of the items that you can claim for is working in special circumstances. So that could be working at height, shift allowances, food allowances. So that's kind of quite a nice example as to, you know, the detail, the items that can be covered. You know, in some ways it's quite good that it's prescriptive. In other ways it's not, because it doesn't give much wriggle room if a particular item isn't covered. And it also just makes it, I would imagine, quite time consuming working out what that cost is by the time you've added up various food allowances, for example. So overtime rates, overtime costs are payable if they relate for contracts A and B to the compensation event, and for C, D and E if they relate to the work generally being carried out. But, and again, this is what we see a sort of series of checks and balances in here. So overtime is payable, but it's providing that the work couldn't have been carried out by other employees who were on site on their ordinary rates. So this is to avoid a situation where certain people are working overtime and getting paid, and others are sat around doing nothing, and poor old client has to pay for everything. So it includes the cost of third-party labour at cost again, but again, checks and balances, it's at cost, but that it's on open market rates or competitively tendered rates, which you know, is fair to both parties. Right, so the next category, equipment. So, you know, this is plant and machinery, basically. It also includes the cost of accommodation, so site accommodation, etc. And this last bullet point, some of the equipment is covered in the charges section. So I mentioned that earlier, things like small tools, the kit that goes inside the site cabins, things like that. And how that's dealt with, because as you can imagine, you know, talk about going into detail, you know, what's the, I don't know, take it to an extreme example, the cost of having a hammer on site, if you still use hammers. This is the DIY construction world. You know, working out costs of really small items is just going to be a bit tortuous. So how we do it is a percentage, and the percentage that you claim is based on the cost of people that we've just looked at times the percentage. Now, where's the percentage? The percentage is what contractor, subcontractor will have included in the contract data part 2. So that's why when I said it's important to fill in the contract data part 2, it is important, because if there's no percentage figure there, I guess it's a 0%, which on my maths comes out at £0, which isn't right. I would say on that point, just whilst I'm waiting for the slide to move, that is one of what I think the unfortunate things that is coming out of NEC for this, using the charges percentage figure, which I think will be problematic because it means you're going back to actually claiming individual costs for these small items, which I think will be pretty counterproductive, to be honest. So, shorter schedule of cost components, the equipment. So what do you get paid for your equipment? Well, it's at the rates listed in the contract data. So that's the contract data. So you can have a published list, and also there's provision for inserting specific items if they're not in a published list. So the items 21 and 22, this is numbering within the schedule, or in this case, the shorter schedule of cost components. It's just for ease of reference if you're looking. If this weekend you choose to read through the shorter schedule of cost components, particularly what people use at 21 is the seeker rates, which I believe are very reasonable rates. And then other equipment is paid, it's priced at competitively tendered or open market rates. And that's item 27. We've already seen that wording, again, part of the checks and balances so that it's not an open checkbook for the client. There we are. Schedule of cost components equipment. So this is the schedule rather than the shorter schedule. So it's the same kind of items, cranes, etc. So what will you get paid? Well, you get paid the higher rate or the rental for equipment that is hired or rented. The checks and balance here is that that's providing it's not owned by your parent, sister company, etc. Because if that is the case, parent, sister, whatever company could charge really extortionate rates, which the client wouldn't think that was very fair. So it's the higher rental cost, assuming basically it's an arm's length transaction. For equipment owned or HP, so owned by the contractor on HP, open market rates are paid. So that items 21 and 22 of the schedule of cost components. So you'll see these numbers. There were similar numbers in the shorter schedule we looked at in the last slide. So the next slide, if it will appear. I'm not sure if these are taking longer. There. Right, so it's still on the schedule, still on equipment. So these are probably going to be very rarely used. So payment for equipment purchased specifically for the works which are the subject of the contract. Providing it's listed in the contract data as having been specifically purchased, is priced on a time-related cost charge. So, I mean, there's a sort of calculation here, but effectively the contract recovers depreciation and usage costs during the period of use. I think the logic there is that if you buy a piece of equipment for a specific project, and I mean, this is going to be fairly rare, I would imagine, or fairly discrete situation, you can use it and basically recover sufficient to pay for any shortfall if you were then to go back onto the open market to sell it on the second-hand market. Also, the special equipment, again, this would be listed in the contract data and payable at the rate stated in that. Now, with those two, please do note that you won't get paid them unless they're either in the contract data or the project manager agrees to them. So you need to think ahead. If either of these are going to be relevant, you need to put them in the contract data before you sign the contract. If it becomes apparent after signing that you're going to be using them, you need to get the project manager's agreement first. If you don't, I don't think it stops you using equipment, but you're not going to get paid the special rates for them unless the client agrees specifically. So just be careful about those. For both of them, so for the schedule and also the shorter schedule, just some miscellaneous points. Equipment includes consumables, so petrol. So that's 25 of both of the schedules for when you're reading it this weekend. She says tongue-in-cheek. It also covers the cost of transporting the equipment to and from work areas, erecting it, dismantling it, and again, checks and balances. You get paid for that, but it's providing it's not already included in the hire or rental rate. So just to make sure there's no double claim. And also, as we've already seen, you can claim the cost of the operatives, providing you haven't already claimed them in the people section. So no double claimings allowed. So some fairly obvious ones there. Okay, so on to plant and materials. So this is the bricks and mortar, etc. Quite nicely here, the schedule and the shorter schedule are identical in this section, which I must say is a bit of a relief when you're going through them. Note that neither therefore covers the cost of procurement. Again, for your works, that's probably not going to be relevant, but on some projects, particularly on bigger projects that you might be involved in, that might become relevant. So it might be something that you want to add in to the contract to make sure that you are entitled to recover that. Oh, these slides are getting slower.
Sarah, are you there?
I am. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I'm not sure whether we've got a bit of a broadband issue at your end.
Can you hear me
now? Apologies to anybody. The sound keeps cutting out a little bit.
Right.
Right, I can hear you again now. That's fine. I don't know whether that's why you've got a bit of a delay on the slides as well.
Can you hear me now? Yeah.
Yes, I can hear you now, yeah.
Yeah, I think it maybe is. Shall I keep going and just jump in?
Yeah, that's fine. That's fine. So apologies to anybody. It's just a mild internet issue that I think we have at the moment. So.
A bit pointless. Okay, so plant and materials. So some sort of miscellaneous items. Okay, I'll just keep going then. So it includes payment of delivery. So as with the equipment, it covers payment for delivering to and from the working areas. removing packaging, etc., sampling, testing. So, you know, from that again, you know, nice examples of how detailed this kind of list of items that you can claim for. Again, checks and balances, contractor provides a credit for payments received for disposing of plant and materials. So that's meant to deter contractor from over-ordering, but equally as part of this checks and balancing, the contractor is entitled to be paid for removing stuff from a site where it hasn't unreasonably over-ordered. Right, so the next item is this funny one, charges. It's not defined in the contract, it's not a defined term. I think of it as consumables. So as we've seen, gas, water, electricity, and that's done as a percentage, as we've looked at already. And it also includes payments to public authorities, which is why, you know, I kind of think of it as a sort of miscellaneous selection of charges that don't kind of fit neatly into any other section. So what does it include? It includes cancellation of a compensation event and the costs, those third-party visits, certificates, etc., and other special services. So I kind of think, I mean, I must admit, in claims, I don't think, I must have come across charges having been claimed, but I don't think it ever really amounts to big sums of money. Having said that, of course, you know, obviously every little helps, and if you don't claim it, it's going to be eating into your profit. So it excludes accommodation, as we've already seen, site cabins, but it does include these other miscellaneous things. So, you know, photocopying, telephones, computers, small tools. So the next two bullet points deal with the percentages. Slightly different way of calculating for them for the schedule of cost components, which is the first one, as opposed to the shorter schedule. As you would expect, the shorter schedule has a wider scope than the schedule, and the simple reason for that is that all, you know, you're using the shorter schedule for, of course, is compensation events. I'm not going to go into too much detail in that because, of course, it's been pulled out for NEC 4, except just to remind you to make sure that you include those percentages in your contract data part 2. As I've said already, it's based on that percentage in the contract data part 2 times the cost of the people for that particular item. Manufacturing, fabrication, not going to go into masses of detail because I don't think this is going to be particularly common for you. So it's for the manufacture and fabrication outside of the working areas, whereas the 4 items we've seen so far have all been for items inside the working area. So the contractor recovers sums paid in the shorter schedule, and in the schedule it recovers hourly rates as set out in the contract data part 2, which is again why it's important to fill it in, plus the overheads calculated as a percentage of that figure. So again, another percentage figure needs to go in there to cover the overhead and profit for that element. Design, similar, it's for off-site design. It's not a defined term under NEC. And again, for this one, the schedule and the shorter schedule are identical, which makes it easier. So it's design carried out outside the working areas. As you'd expect with design, you're paying hourly rates. So the hourly rates need to be included in the contract data. And again, I raise the issue, if you don't include any hourly rates, does that mean the charge is £0 per hour, which wouldn't be good news for the contractor or subcontractor? Subcontractor in a subcontract situation, and it's multiplied by the number of hours that the design takes to complete. So the overhead calculation, again, it's a percentage. Again, it's set out in the contract data. So, for all these percentages, your business needs to decide what is the appropriate percentage for your business and for the type of work being carried out. And also the cost of travel is payable in addition. Right. Insurance, we're just going to skim past that because you know that you're not going to really, on your day-to-day work, get paid anything for that. So just a few issues that I've probably touched upon. So problems that we have with both of the schedules, to be fair, with the people section, so the cost of people in the working areas, is this whole thing about having to show what they cost you. So, if you've paid for overnight accommodation for them, for meals, for, health insurance, if they have a company car, this is all cost, but you've got to arguably, strictly speaking, in accordance with the contract, you've got to evidence all this, which I think must be really tortuous, and can be a way that a project manager causes problems for contractors. It also raises data protection issues, which we're probably not as paranoid about as we were 18 months ago, but there are some valid issues there. There's also an issue about self-employed people. Are they the people section or are they subcontractors for contracts C, D, and E? Keeping records of who is doing the work and what they're doing and how long it takes. Now, I don't think we'll ever get away from that because, even with JCT, you have to provide that. But, it's all extra paperwork to be provided. Average rates aren't allowed. And also, issues about who's included within the people category and who's included within that fee. Equipment, which rates do you use? And I suppose that's just down to negotiation, because once it's in the contract data part 2, it's in, it's agreed, but make sure you get something in and make sure it's agreed and it gets into the contract data part 2. And again, it's all about, proving the cost, but also proving the allocation of that piece of equipment to a particular task on site. So specifically, or particularly for, say, a compensation event under option A, you already have a piece of equipment on site. It has to be used for a compensation event. It's no good just being able to say, well, here's the cost of that piece of equipment. You also need to prove it, show presumably by documentary evidence, the period of time that piece of equipment was engaged upon the compensation event work as opposed to the lump sum price work. But again, it's no different in that respect to JCT. Problems with the plant and materials in both. Again, very, very, very similar issues. So NEC4. So just a couple of kind of miscellaneous things here, actually. These are new compensation events in NEC4. So the first one is number 20, which is the contractor's cost of preparing a quote for a proposed instruction in circumstances where the project manager doesn't accept it. So that is a very, very discrete area. So it's a quote, so that's number one. It's got to be for a proposed instruction, not an instruction as such. So this is, the proposed instruction is the scenario where project manager thinks it might like certain work doing, which is going to be a compensation event. So they issue a proposed instruction, basically to get the work priced and then decide, do they want it, don't they? So it's got to be a proposed instruction, not an instruction generally. And the project manager has then got to say, actually, not accepting it as you were, carry on with the original scope of work. And also we've slightly confusingly, we've got this new CE 21, which is basically allowing extra compensation events to be included in the contract data. I can see why you might want to do that rather than have it in a Z clause, particularly if you haven't got any other Z clauses, just jot it down in the contract data. But I just think it just makes it a bit more confusing. Okay, so coming back to the schedule of cost components and fee, and I've already covered some of this. So first of all, what we're going to look at is what has been added by NEC4. So I've already mentioned the subcontractor section. So we've got a new section in the schedule of cost components and the shorter schedule that details the costs to be paid to subcontractors, which I think is going to make things a lot clearer, more easy to understand. And it also means that the definition of defined cost doesn't specifically refer to subcontractor costs, because all it now refers to is basically the information, the costs that come out of the schedule of cost components. I just think it's so much clearer. Shorter schedule of cost components, what's been added, which I think will be really, really good, this. People rates, so this is, remember, just for options A and B. So it's just going to be for compensation events for those contracts. But it means that we've got rates rather than cost. So you still have to show, that for a particular compensation event, Fred Bloggs was working on that compensation event for 3 hours, on the morning of the 30th of April. But what you don't need to do is that tortuous exercise of proving what you pay Fred Bloggs, what his national insurance costs you, what the tax costs you, what his health insurance, his company car, blah, 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 costs, because you just have a specific rate. And it also means you've got a rate for, site foremen, no matter how many you have on site, or labourers, rather than having to go through individuals who might all be on different packages and different rates. Just beware there of missing a category. You might want some coverall, to say, any others will be paid on, market rates, or will be paid on cost. But, that would be fairly horrendous if one category of person wasn't included. So I think we might have missed one. Added. Sorry, guys. Yeah, sorry, I missed this slide. Did I? Yes, I did. Shows that I'm paying attention anyway. Yeah, so NEC4, what has been removed? So the shorter schedule of cost components for options C, D, and D. So we saw that in certain circumstances, the shorter schedule could be adopted and used by the parties for options C, D, and E. So that's been taken out, which I think just makes it easier. It just streamlines it a bit. Also, quite upsettingly, and I've already referred to this, these percentages that we've got in the charges section, which are the working areas overhead and the people overhead, they've been removed. I think that's a retrograde step, because I'm all for, the rates that we've just seen being added for people, and percentages being used, just to speed up the process and make it a bit less administrative. And the subcontractor fee has been deleted, because of course we've got the subcontractor now in the schedule of cost components proper. Apologies for that. I hope I haven't missed any other slides as we've gone on. So that brings us to any questions, anyone?
I should have one coming up now.
Right. Mark Roper, the schedule of cost components would probably be the starting point for the additional monies requested to cover any economic work during the COVID-19 pandemic. Yes, I mean, if you came, or if you were listening to the webinar that we did a couple of weeks ago on COVID-19, she racks her brain, we were looking at claiming under predominantly compensation event 19, which is that funny one. It's sort of the force majeure, but it doesn't talk about force majeure. It talks about basically contractor or subcontractor not being able to complete for reasons beyond anyone's control. So that's a compensation event. You might also be arguing that, if the client stopped you from working, that they've not allowed you access to site or on one of those compensation events. So absolutely, the schedule of cost components is where you go to claim your costs. On CD&E, don't forget your subcontractors' costs, because they're separate, and obviously don't forget that all-important fee percentage, because that's your overhead and profit.
Has anyone else got any further questions to come in? We haven't actually had that many questions this afternoon. No?
What I would say is I tried to amend the slides, so you'll have noticed that our firm's been taken over by Knights, so we've got a new house style. So somebody did the slides for me, and I tried to amend them to put my email address on, as I usually do, so that if you have any queries, you can email me. And somehow it hasn't saved, so I suspect that's not supposed to happen. We're not supposed to have our emails on. But it's if you want to email me questions, that you might think of in the next week or so, it's sarah.wilson at knightsplc.com. So it's really easy, Sarah with an H, and I will come back to you if you want to do that.
Okay,